How are you doing, Simon A.C. Martin? Do we pronounce the A.C.? I've always wondered this because you obviously, it's your signature full name, but is it just Simon Martin or Simon A.C. Martin? Which one do you prefer?
So I've always preferred Simon A.C. Martin because there's an awful lot of Simon Martins. It's always been my way of kind of differentiating myself.
So it's standing out in the crowd. Absolutely, yeah. And it's something, especially with authors, you need that name that's unique to you. Otherwise, it's very easy, as you say, to be lost behind anybody else with that name. So you've got a new book coming out, and this is a follow-up to the Edward Thomas book that you did. Sorry, Edward Thompson book that you did, who was the wartime CME of the LNER. But his predecessor, I think for a lot of people, much more famous. And I think if for pretty much anybody in the railway world, if you asked to name a famous CME, Sir Nigel Gresley is probably going to be the one that they talk about, with some very iconic designs, and certainly in terms of capturing the aesthetic mood of the 20s and more so the 30s, with that Art Deco style, with the streamlining. It was very much up there. So I've got my notes. I have been having a quick look through.
Can I just ask one thing, Jen?
Yes.
Have you let him speak yet?
I think sorry, I'm very wordy. Do feel free.
We've worked together on 2 TV shows, and if we ever got a word in edgeways, it was lovely. But Jen's really good at that. That's her job. Let her do it.
Yeah, it's. I must say, I've done talk radio in the past, and you get used to just talking and talking and talking, and sometimes it's very easy to forget to let the other person get their word in edgeways. But one of the interesting things, actually, I hadn't realised, but when I was looking through your new book, Sir Nigel Gresley actually trained at the start. He was more of an LMS man because he served an apprenticeship with the London and North Western Railway and then moved to the Lancashire and Yorkshire before he made the move to the Great Northern Railway, where perhaps he became most famous. And do you feel that influenced a lot of his later designs?
In short, no. Well, let's put it another way. So he was definitely from the outset something of a Northwestern and then a Yorkshire. Bearing in mind, of course, that his actual heritage was he was born in Edinburgh. His family was Scottish and English, and they lived all over the country, but mostly in the north of England. And then he was in the southern part, which was living in and around London, actually, when he was working for the LNER. But everything that he saw when he was working for the London North Western Railway, and everything that he then did at the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, informed, I think, his thinking when he went onto the Great Northern Railway. And a lot of it was actually what he didn't want to do. And it's quite obvious, actually, because you get... On the LNWR, you've got things like the experiments, the precedents, and they're wonderful machines, not particularly well thought of by enthusiasts, and I think that point of view has got to change. But Gresley, in his early days, was actually more in the Ivert mould, and I think very much Henry Ivert's influence in him, and actually John Aspel as well, in terms of a simpler approach to engineering, can be seen very, very clearly in his earliest designs. When you look at, for example, the J6 is just a direct move forward of Ivert's J5 locomotive. When you look at his first mogul, the K1s, which then became the K2s, he's applied outside Walshart's valve gear, which looks more complicated, but actually it's a really good, solid valve gear setup. And all he's done is actually stretch the proportions and change the wheelbase arrangement of things that are really Ivert in design. And it's not until we get to, for example, the K3s, which is really where Gresley's thinking starts to take off in a big way, along with his 280 freight engines, that we see that Gresley actually has his own ideas. And I think, you know, the best engineers actually take a lot of the knowledge, not in what is necessarily successful, but what's actually maybe not as successful and how not to apply it to their own work.
So it's almost a case that his apprenticeships with the London and North Western Railway and the Lancashire and Yorkshire showed him a lot of ways where he thought, I can do better than that. There must be a better way than that. So in effect, it gave him very much a grounding in that kind of thing. And am I right in thinking that he was very much more of a practical person? He preferred to learn by doing the job rather than by going to textbook learning, so to speak. So he was a very practical, hands-on kind of guy.
I think we've got to be careful with that, because there's always a fear, or for me anyway, that sometimes we can make people seem maybe less educated, but they're not, or that they weren't as academic, which in Gresley's case, he won awards while he was at school. But he went and did practical apprenticeships in order to gain the experience on the front line, actually see what was happening on a working railway. And that's really important. That's why when he was actually head of the LNER, when he was the chief mechanical engineer, he really pushed for apprenticeships. He really pushed the premium apprentices working directly for him to learn from him. He used his technical assistants and he taught them, and he was really big on people going through to do their qualifications, but also to get that hands-on practical experience of being in a railway workshop. And you're absolutely right, Jen, you're absolutely on the money. He valued that immensely.
And one of the things that he did bring very much to the railway scene was there was a lot of Pacifics. The Pacific wheel arrangement seemed to be something that he very much favoured, whereas before the days that he became the CME at the Great Northern Railway, it was very much geared towards the Atlantic or the 440 type wheel arrangements. And he seems to have been very forward thinking in seeing what Vincent Raven did with the original A2s and go, they're not, there's problems, but I can see what he was trying for. And it's in some respects, my reading of it was, it's like he could see what needed improving to make it work. And in many ways, you could say he did.
So we need to be careful, because actually the work on a Pacific locomotive for the Great Northern Railway started in 1915. So the original developments around when the Great Western Railway had their first Pacific, the Great Bear. And you had the K4s in America, the Pennsylvania K4s, who were running really good work, like performances in excess of anything that was really known at that time. But Gresley's design, his Pacific that eventually became Great Northern of 1922, his development was ahead of Sir Vincent Raven. Raven actually was the last of the three CMEs who was building Pacifics to pick it up, but he picked Gresley to the post just about with his two Raven Pacifics. They were on the drawing board for a very short period of time. Raven's Pacifics are actually really a success story in reacting to what the other railway is doing and producing something that's actually workable. But Gresley didn't write them off, and I think that's really interesting. When he became CME, you've got to unite the Great Northern Railway, which was the second largest of the big railways involved in the London North Eastern Railway, the North Eastern Railway, which was technically the largest, with the largest amount of rolling stock, and then, of course, the Great Central Railway, and then you've got the Great Eastern Railway, which is sort of a poor relation, the fourth one, and then lots of little railways, including some of the Scottish lines. But Gresley was actually quite clever, and in his programme of works, in building new locomotives for the LNER, he picked out Great Central designs, he picked out North Eastern Railway designs, he picked out Great Eastern and Great Northern Railway designs, some of which were his own, some of which were Raven, Robinson and Hill's. So he actually unified the railway very cleverly, because he was still building things that were recognisable to all of those different regions. And he built 4 more Raven Pacifics.
Right.
And it's astonishing. I think they had, it was 4 total, I think. I haven't got my notes in front of me. But the point is that he built more of them. He applied some Gresley accoutrements, such as the Cartazzi just under the cab, which eliminated the issues that the original Raven Pacific had, which was having the radial truck just underneath the ashband, which, frankly, Raven should have seen and had not fitted in the first place.
Mm.
I think you're right. He was well ahead of his time, well ahead of his time on so many different things. But he was always looking around him. He was always looking at what everyone else was doing. What are the trends of the time? And he was looking not just in railways, but in general engineering. And that's how we get to, for example, the Hush Hush in 1929, because he notices the Art Deco movement, he recognises it, he embraces it. He thinks about streamlining, he thinks about scientific advancement. Actually, he is, for me, one of the few railway engineers who's not just a locomotive engineer. He's actually really a systems engineer, one of the first systems engineers, because he's not just building and designing locomotives, he's also talking about how the rolling stock interacts, how the signalling interacts, infrastructure, including electrification.
I mean, some of the other things that he was responsible for were things like the Gresley teak coaches, very iconic rolling stock, first for the Great Northern Railway, but then later on continued to be built under the London and North Eastern Railway. And some of the things that he was doing was, for example, articulation, to reduce the amount of dead weight, to make it so that there's much more weight in a train that is filled by fare-paying passengers rather than the rolling stock itself. And he also seemed to very much embrace streamlining, more so than any of the other railways. And it feels, with especially the likes of the Great Western Railway, that they treated it as a fad. And when you see a streamlined king, it looks like somebody's done it like, well, if you're making me do it, oh, there we go. But he was very much keen on reducing things like drag, with the coaches closer together with shrouds, so that you didn't have these kind of vacuums with the skirts at the bottom. And how much was that about the aesthetic? I mean, obviously Art Deco was big at the time, and how much of it was practical efficiency?
I'm going to tell you this now, from the development of the W1 in 1929 all the way through to the coronation with the observation coach and the A4 on the front. It was all scientific. Very little of it was actually aesthetically driven, aside from perhaps the livery, on both the Silver Jubilee and the coronation and the A4s.
Yeah.
You have to remember that he was working alongside people from the National Physics Laboratory.
Yeah.
And Frederick Johansen, for example, who's one of their leading lights in the late 1920s, early 1930s. So he's working with Gresley over at the LNER, and then he's working with Stanier over at the LMS, and he's working with the Southern Railway, which at the time I think was Maunsell. And they were all working on individual proposals and individual changes, and they were basically taking wooden models and throwing chalk over them into a wind tunnel. But the first of these was the W1, for which the work really started in 1927. They started really developing the W1 way ahead of anyone else. I cannot find an earlier, genuinely, truly, scientifically designed streamlined locomotive than Gresley's W1. And actually, we should put that here. The W1 is the first British streamlined locomotive, by far.
And I mean, also that a very revolutionary boiler design as well. He wasn't afraid to try something very different with the Yarrow very high pressure marine type boiler. It was something that hadn't really been done before. And to me, he was very able to break from the mold. It wasn't a case of, but we've always done things like this. And it's interesting that, for example, a lot of the locomotive designs that came before him that were things like Atlantics, but he only introduced one Atlantic, the C9, and he was very much at the forefront of moving forward, looking at the American designs for the Mogul with the Baldwins that were imported, and doing things very differently. But at the point that the railway grouping came along, he was the CME at the Great Northern Railway, but was then suddenly faced with the amalgamation of the LNER, and effectively having to apply for his own job again. And
it wasn't much of an application, though. If we're being honest, Jen, I think everyone knew, including Robinson, who was being supported by his own chairman on the Great Central.
Yeah, Lord Farrington was pushing for Robinson.
But everyone knew it was going to be Gresley, I think. It was pretty obvious. What is it? Raven and Robinson were both in their mid-60s.
It's about 66 for Robinson, which was a year after the enforced retirement age. So even though he had Lord Farrington pushing him to be the CME, he was technically a year past the compulsory retirement age. And then there was two others who were going to retire anyway, and then you had other CMEs who had, like the Glasgow and South Western Rail, is it Haywood, who'd only done one loco design.
Haywood. Was he on the Great North of Scotland Railway?
Yes, I knew it was one of the Scottish ones, and I think it's the D40 was his only loco design. So effectively,
well, that was Pickersgill, really.
Absolutely, yeah. So
he produced a variation on it, but it's a Pickersgill design, really. I think it's very clear. Gresley was the man at the moment. He was producing really quite wonderful locomotives for Great Northern Railway, the K3 and then the Pacific. You had the N2, you had the O2, you had so many different designs that actually really showed a way forward. I think what was really interesting about Gresley is that in his early years, you could say he was actually a little bit more conservative because he produced two classes of 060 tender engine, which were effectively just improved versions of his J6s. But it's that little bit of creeping improvement in every aspect of his design where we get to the 1930s. And in answer to one of the people in your chat, because I've just noticed the question that popped up about, is an A4 just a streamlined A3? The answer to that is no. The A4 is so much more complicated than that. I go into this in the book quite a lot, but actually, the Pacific arrangement, no doubt, that comes from the A3. And the kind of the boiler size and shape and the overall proportions of the A4 locomotive, they're all derived from the A3. But where it gets clever, it's actually building on all the development that we've seen with the original W1, with the P2s. You look at the A4, and actually, if you put the W1 as built and then the A4 side by side, you actually see where they lifted certain aspects of the streamlining from the W1 to incorporate into the A4. In particular, the single chimney. I think it's, you know, we talk about Gresley as this man, this great man, but he was scientifically minded, and in every single iteration of his designs, you see an improvement. So, for example, in the A4s, you've got streamlining of air passages, you've got streamlining of the outer casing, but it's not just that. You've got slightly different materials are used. You've got them realising that actually you're not just having to streamline the locomotive, you've got to streamline the whole train to match with it as well.
Absolutely,
to make that high-speed railway.
Absolutely. One of the things that surprised me is that whilst there's this focus on the big express locomotives, things like the A3s, the A4s, he only designed one 060 shunting locomotive, the J50. Well, technically the J50, J51, but they're pretty much the same thing. And you know, a very successful locomotive. But was it a case that there were so many other designs that were already in service? Was there just not a need for these small shunting locomotives, or was it a case that the J50 was so successful there was no need to actually do anything else?
Well, I think off the top of my head there were 110 of them, so they were by no means a small class, but they were maybe rather more spread out across the network where they were needed. In the West Riding and then over in London, some of them actually getting pretty far south and going over Blackfriars flyover into Hither Green. You know, these lovely tank engines supplemented a lot of the really robust, powerful 060s. And if we're being really, truly honest with ourselves, the J50 was again a development of locomotives that he had seen before. But he really, you know, you look at that J50 and he nailed the design, frankly, for the LNER. And that's why Thompson actually wanted to build more of them during the Second World War. Not just wanting both of them, wanting to build diesel shunters by the 1940s, but they wanted more of the J50s. They really were just a fantastic design. And that's borne out, actually, by the statistics I collated for the book, which showed that they were one of the best performing 060 tank engines in the whole of the United Kingdom.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I suppose the only other one that I guess is a nod that towards where he saw a design that was good and fit for purpose, he wasn't afraid to keep building them. The J72 was also perpetuated with a number of further batches being made. But certainly, I mean, the J50, it's a tragedy that none survive, because it is... It's like the ultimate in terms of utility, in terms of getting the best tractive effort with the water in the tanks, providing that additional adhesive weight over the driving wheels, but also the way it fits so perfectly within the loading gauge.
Well, there's a question I've just spotted that's come up from Jennifer Horton about how much the work was actually Gresley's. That's a really good question to ask. And I'm going to be really direct. Pretty much all of it that's accredited to Gresley is because Gresley is involved. And she's right to bring that up, because we have misconceptions about how chief mechanical engineers, how mechanical engineers actually organise their staff and what actually gets done. And in Gresley's case, as I say in the book, you've got people like Bert Spencer, Norman Newson. You've got Frederick Johansen at the National Physics Laboratory. You've got Edward Thompson and Oliver Bullion, two men he hired specifically to join him at the Great Northern Railway in order to support his work. You've got all of these knowledgeable men doing all of these different roles who actually add to his overall vision. So you're absolutely right to ask that question, and it's a really good question. But the reason we give the CME the credit is because he ties it all together. In everything that he does, he takes ideas and he meshes them together and says, okay, how can we modify it? How can we do this better? On the A4, for example, he gave rough outlines of what he wanted, and it went through so many different iterations, so many different drawings, but Gresley was always pushing for, no, I want an error design, go and get the R101 specification, go and get the drawings, give me the aerofoil shape, give me the teardrop shape that I want. And because he pushed for that, we got this beautiful streamlined shape that actually, when it was tested at the National Physics Laboratory, say it quietly, it was actually better in a number of different ways than the Coronation locos. And although conventional wisdom would say you want the most bulbous front end and then you want to taper in at the back, when it comes to trains, when he was designing it to go with a streamlined train, the A4 was far superior.
And is the story about them having problems with the smoke lifting, and somebody completely accidentally got a thumbprint in it, and they tested...
Eric Bannister, that was the...
Is that a true story?
Bannister, thumbprint, back of the chimney, and then Frederick Hans goes, oh, maybe we should test that again. What is that doing? And they tested it a few times, and it was lifting the smoke away, because actually the way they had the chimney originally was it was straight across into the boiler casing, very much like on the W1 and on the P2. When they realised that this indentation actually allowed the smoke to go up because it was creating a vortex, that's how we get the iconic A4 shape, and they raised the stovepipe chimney up higher. Brilliant. Absolute genius. But, as you say, and I love this, it's accidental.
So they had no inkling that they needed to do something like that. It was just purely somebody stuck their finger where they shouldn't have.
Well, let's be fair. The A4 was going to have deflectors. The reason that the A4 casing and the W1 casing is actually quite similar in certain ways, particularly if you look directly head-on, you look at the positioning of the chimneys, is actually because they were intending to fit deflectors very much like the W1 onto the A4 Pacific. I'm very glad they didn't. The A4 is beautiful as it is, but it's also the most refined design. And that's not a surprise, because the W1 was the first. It was always going to have some issues, because one of them had to be first. And the P2s, well, the double car chap that lengths fitted properly north, smoke deflection was pretty much fine. But on El Marischal, which had piston valves, not as good. And when they realised that the A4 shape was better, they applied it to all of the P2s.
So something I've always wondered about the A4s is how did they retain their streamlining into British Rail days when a lot of other streamlined locomotives became de-streamlined? What was it about the A4 design that they kept it?
I think it's multifactored, Jen. I think it's, firstly, smoke deflection was a big deal. Secondly, the amount of horsepower they were using to power trains to high speeds significantly reduces with the streamlined casing.
Right.
And everyone on the LNER knew this because they'd seen the statistics. They'd looked into everything that was going on. There was no way the A4s were going to be streamlined. The reason the Duchesses were streamlined, I think personally, is because they knew the casing's actually not very good. When you look at the different types of testing that the LMS and the LNER did alongside each other, Gresley, very early on when developing the A4, saw a particular shape, realised how significant it was and picked it, and the LMS picked the more bulbous shape because it matched what was going on the continent.
Right.
But on the continent and here, people were not thinking we need to streamline the locomotive and the train behind it, the whole thing. And what you actually ended up with was, for example, the German 05 streamlined train, carriages sort of streamlined, but they haven't actually designed them together, which I find extraordinary. Today, you'd never have that. When you look at the Azuma, look at the LNER Azuma of modern day, I promise you this. Line up the A4 with the coronation set behind and the beaver tail, now position it next to your LNER Azuma, and you'll be astonished at the amount of design cues that the Azuma has that are literally lifted from everything that Gresley did with the A4s and his streamlined trains.
So you can still see that heritage of the ground that he made back in the 20s and 30s, still very much at the forefront of the physics of making trains work now. Even though we've moved completely on from steam power, some of the work that he was doing with the streamlining is very much still at the cutting edge, literally.
Yes, agree. And I've just noticed a controversial question about Great Northern, and I'll very quickly answer it. No, Thompson did not rebuild Great Northern out of spite. It was next in works. It was very, very tired. It was knackered. Thompson's A1 was an excellent design. If it had, as had been intended, the A4 streamlining, no one would have been complaining at all because everyone would have gone, this is a natural development of Gresley's designs. End of discussion.
And I guess that no CME would have had the luxury of being able to do things on a whim just out of spite. You know, they had to... They would have to account for every decision. I mean, locomotives are a very big capital expense, and you can't just scrap one on a whim as a spite thing against your predecessor. One of the things I wanted to ask is, how did Sir Nigel Gresley feel when they named one of the A4s after him?
Well, I had the pleasure of talking to one of his surviving relatives, Ben Godfrey, about a month ago when I did a talk for the Gresley Society. And the pride in that particular locomotive, which was also the 100th Pacific built for the LNER, you can't put a measure on that. There's not just pride that he was proud of it. He was very grateful because when you see the photograph, he was surrounded by all of these men who had worked alongside and helped him get to this point with the railway. And they were all loyal, they were all hardworking. And in that crowd of people, in that famous photograph, you have, again, Oliver Bulliard, Edward Thompson. You've got so many of the usual names and suspects that come up where Gresley's name is mentioned. I mean, it wasn't named just for him, though. It's not just a recognition of him. It's a recognition of everything he has done for the railway with his team. And that's why it was such a big deal.
And, of course, you've also written the book on Edward Thompson, and he's the man who had to fill the shoes after Sir Nigel Gresley. And how difficult was that to follow on from somebody who'd been so pioneering as Gresley, especially because you had the double whammy that he was doing it during wartime, so there were huge restrictions on what they could and couldn't do. budgets were very restrained. Being able to get hold of the materials were very restrained. And you're the foremost expertise now globally on Edward
very
Thompson.
kind.
It's true. I mean, you've written effectively the definitive book. But Edward Thompson sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap. But do you think that there's much more to that, in that he was very restricted, that if he'd have been a peacetime CME in a pre-war condition, he would have been able to shine very much more?
I think we need to be careful about speculation, because the reality was, without Gresley passing away, I don't think that Thompson would have been able to be CME anywhere else. Not because he was a bad engineer, not because he had a bad reputation, but because you had Bullied on the Southern, you had Stanier, who was then replaced by Fairburn on the LMS, and then Ibert, because unfortunately Fairburn passed away well before his time. There weren't many opportunities to become a CME anywhere else. But I think really interestingly that much of the evidence has been telling me, that I've done over the last 10 years, that actually Gresley had in mind certain individuals that could take over from him, or needed to have the knowledge to support whoever took over from him.
And how
Thompson being one of them.
How difficult is it as well to, I wanted to touch on the subject of the research for this. Obviously, you've gone so much more in depth than has appeared in print before. How difficult is it this far on from the event? We're coming up on like 80 or more years since he passed away. How difficult is it to get down to the bottom of the truth? Because one of the things that I've found in research, and I'm sure that you've had the same, is that you get very much a sense of, oh, well, we've always thought this, therefore we're not open to a different point of view, or different evidence coming to light. How much difficulty have you found trying to get to the bottom of it all, to get the perfect research for the books?
I have been very lucky, because the London North Eastern Railway put pretty much every single bit of paper into a single archive, which is either in the National Rail Museum at York or the National Archives at Kew, right? And I live not far from Kew. I'm in West London. And there are many, many different individuals who have collections of their own and have collected research, including one Tim Hillier-Graves, who I would say, if your very kind thing about me being the authority on Thompson, I bow to Tim Hillier-Graves on that. I would say I might be the technical authority in terms of the statistics and similar, but Tim Hillier-Graves is the authority on Thompson's personal life, for sure. And I encourage everyone to go and find his book, and in fact his book's on Gresley, because we actually sort of complement each other. We have different aspects of the story. But how difficult was the research? I think the research was difficult in so much there was so much to go through. I have every single page from the LNER board minutes from 1923 through to 1948, and all of the LNER committee meetings that I took photographs of for my own private research in order to then write and think about all of these different books. And there's a huge amount of material. And it's not just those. You've got reports, you've got drawings, you've got photographs. The LNER made it incredibly easy for someone like me to go to all of these different places and go, oh, actually, here's a load of evidence. So let's talk about this evidence. And the thing that I found, and I'm going to be maybe a bit controversial here, the thing I found really appalling about some of the books that have been written previously in terms of LNER history, particularly where Thompson is concerned, but actually also about Gresley, is there's a huge lack of research of the primary evidence base, and a desire to just focus on ultimate performance and timekeepers stats, and not really talk about what the railway was actually supposed to be doing, which is carrying passengers and freight. I mean, the measure of a railway isn't how fast Mallard went in 1938. As wonderful as that achievement is, that's not the measure of how good a CME Sir Nigel Gresley or Edward Thompson or Arthur Peppercorn or whoever is. It's, did their locomotives and rolling stock and did everything they do for the railway actually improve how the railway worked.
Yeah, in terms of
run to time.
absolutely.
And did they do it efficiently?
Yeah, efficient. Cost in maintenance, the amount of fuel they use to do a given task. There's so much more than just the actual speed. And of course, people think of Mallard as, oh, it can do 126 miles an hour. I mean, it rather thrashed to do that.
Wow.
But
I think thrashed, yes. I have a sneaking suspicion that you'll see it in the book.
absolutely.
You'll see it in the finished version of the book.
And I must ask, where can people find this book and also your previous book on Edward Thompson as well? Where can they go out and buy it?
Right, it is Strathwood Publishing Limited.
Mm-hmm.
They sell all of my books, including the British Railway stories, for which there's 3 books in that series.
Oh, right.
The Gresley book isn't available for pre-order yet, but it will be. We're in the process of doing the print-ready copy, for which my nerves, I am jittery already, because there were some unfortunate errors in the Thompson book in terms of setting out and grammar that I wish we'd caught, but we are doing our best to make sure.
Can I just say, as a published author myself, it's what they call Gaiman's law. No matter how many times you read through it, how much proofreading you do, how many other people go through and proof it, when you finally think everything is perfect and you send it off and it gets printed, if you get the first copy back and you open it on any random page, you will find an error. And it's the law, I'm afraid. It happens. It happens to us all.
You're so right.
But I did want to talk a little bit about the Great British Railway stories. And that's, for a lot of people, that's where they know you from. How long ago was it that you did the first one?
We put out the first episode of the YouTube series of what was then the British Railway series, which I retitled as Stories because I didn't want to make too many comparisons to Audrey's work. But the first episode was in 2007.
Gosh.
And the last episode was in 2012.
So did the book come after the YouTube series, or did it appear alongside?
No, the YouTube series was first, based on books that I was writing and never published. So now what we're doing, quite funny actually this. So in 2013 I self-published Tale of the Unnamed Engine. That was the first book. Since then, I was found by Kevin Derrick at Stratford Publishing. He's been amazing. He's been the best editor. And we've since published the original book again, but as a hardback. Then Great Western Glory, which took about 10 years to write. And that came out just over a year ago now. And then last year, we did the first of our YouTube story collections, which is based on everything that we did on YouTube.
Yeah.
I'm really pleased to say we've got the second collection is actually being illustrated by Dean Walker again as we speak. That should be out by the end of the year. The Nigel Gresley book is coming out in the next couple of months.
Right.
So keep an eye out on the Stratford Publishing website. There will be a pre-order link shortly.
And also, of course, people may recognise you from our screens. You've been certainly, when I first met you up in Scotland, when we were filming Biggest Little Railway, that was my introduction to Simon A.C. Martin. And we since went on, we were both on the same team on the second series of Great Model Railway Challenge.
And that was a great pity because I think we did really well on that show. And we don't always get the luck we wanted. But I was really proud of both the shows we made together, Jen.
Absolutely. And, I think, it's very easy to see a lot of stuff gets lost in the edit. And if you're not the team that wins a particular episode, then a lot of what you did is lost for time purposes. And I thought that we did a particularly good job when you consider you're building quite an epic model railway from scratch in 3 days, with the added distraction that you've got a camera crew buzzing around going, oh, could you just do that again? Or you're just about to drill something and they go, oh, sorry, quiet in the studio. And it's actually a very difficult environment to do that. But are you
Jen, our War of the Worlds layout that we did with Les and the rest of the team, that, for me, one of the highlights of my life in terms
That
of railway
was-
modelling.
And
That was wonderful.
I thoroughly enjoyed building that, and it's something I always say that it was almost embarrassing. We were finished about a day early with that because everything hooked
Yes.
up, and it was a textbook example of when everything goes right and everything goes your way.
Yeah.
And I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed the experience of building that as well because we knew exactly what we were doing. We worked so well on that particular build as a team.
Yes.
And it was such a great experience. And when people have asked me, like, if you get the chance to be on a TV series, should you do it? I always say to them, yes, go for it. Because if you don't do it, you will regret the fact that you didn't do it. Because you'll see it on TV and it will look like a great wheeze. And you think, oh, I could have been there. And that was... I suppose nothing better to illustrate that than Biggest Little Railway. I mean, you know yourself, the midges, the rubbish catering, the damp, the cold.
Right. Can I just say on that, though, as I get older, the memories of how bad the midges were
Yeah, they fade.
seems to be disappearing from me.
And just the
until
good ones.
Lawrence shows me one photograph of me every year without fail. Lawrence Robbins, who's the team captain. He shows me this photograph of me looking so dejected, like horrendously dejected. And then Dick Strawbridge handing me this pint of beer and the smile that comes from being handed this pint
But,
of beer.
I mean, it was a fabulous achievement.
Oh.
And no matter
Yes.
how hard it was physically and mentally, I always look back at it and I always say to people, it doesn't matter how hard the experience was, you will always appreciate the fact that you did it, that you did something that you can point to and say, I was part of that.
Yes, I
And-
completely agree.
Do you have any other TV appearances in the horizon? Anything else you're working on?
I have been working on a lot of things, but they're mostly book related.
Right. Yeah.
I'm currently in the process of looking at my further education again. So watch this space. That's a really big deal for me because I really, I'm at that stage of my life where I want to be the best professional I can be. So I'm doing lots of different things in that way. A lot of my time is taken up with Network Rail now, working for Greater Anglia region. And frankly, I've not seen anything that I've been offered that I would like to do. But if the right offer came up, well, I'd have to ask the boss.
But of course, as well, I mean, your other hobby is your Volvo, your 740 Volvo, which did appear in one of the Great British Railway stories. You managed to get your car, your pride and joy into that book, and you now must be one of the few people who've actually got a Volvo 740. And I'm very jealous because my first car was a 740 GL Saloon. And I still regret to this day letting that car go. It was such a great car. And you've still got one.
Yeah, and it's just out there on the forecourt. I'm working on fixing the gearbox because it's always the gearbox.
It is
but
an
I'm hoping
auto
to get it
box. They
fixed for
like
the
that.
summer.
But
It is the auto box, but it's always the torque converter. I don't know what it is about old Volvos, but the torque converter always goes out of kilter.
yeah, well, with
every
the
50,000 miles.
well, with the manual box, mine was a manual, and it's always the synchromesh. Usually
Yes.
on third gear. I don't know why, but
Yeah.
third gear synchromesh always is the first to go.
That's like it was on my 240 as well, Jen.
Oh yeah, so where is that now? Because you literally saved that from a bush. It had been growing into a bush for God knows how long.
It's currently in store, and we'll see what the future holds for it. But the long-term plan is to get the 740 back out to car shows again.
Brilliant, and certainly one to look out for. I've seen the photos of you at the Festival of the Unexceptional, which is quite a peculiar concept until you realise there's so many familiar vehicles there which were once two a penny on the roads that you just don't see anymore. And it's so lovely to see that some people have kept things like Vauxhall Carltons and Volvo 740s and stuff. And it's quite shocking how few of these vehicles are actually left.
What I like that the concept will be really quick with this, but the Festival of the Unexceptional, for anyone who doesn't know, is a car show dedicated to all of the everyday cars you used to see on the road way back when. So 90s, 80s, 70s, and forward. And every year they bring it forward another year so you can get more cars into the show. But the other day I realised that I hadn't seen, for example, Mazda 323 for forever, or Vauxhall Cavalier, or any of these different cars.
Yeah.
And, you know, shows like that, it really brings something back from your childhood or from, you know, teenage years and adulthood, and it's really wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, things like a Mark 1 Ford car. When did you last see one of those? And yet they used to be everywhere. So what year are they up to with that now? What's the cut-off point?
God. I think the cut-off point is 2002 or 2003 now.
Oh,
so we're getting into more of the modern era, but I think they do it in a good way. I can't imagine, I know I'm going to get castigated for this, but I can never imagine seeing like today's modern minis as classics.
Yeah.
But the old new Mini is now a classic, and I love it.
Yeah, but I'm very mindful that you do need to go. It's 8 o'clock now, so
yes, I apologise.
Absolutely,
Jenny,
look,
it's always so good to see you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're absolutely welcome. It's been great to have a chat about your new book and some of your other projects as well. Always time for the Volvo 740 as well. And as always, you put me to shame. You're so impeccably dressed, so much so that we gave you the nickname Mr. Bond, because you were sort of like a cross between the Saint and James Bond.
Oh, I like that comparison. I think I prefer the Saint comparison.
Well, he did drive a Volvo
Simon as well,
and he did drive a Volvo.
He did.
But look, anyway, look, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Look, you take care.
We must speak soon, okay?
Absolutely, will do. Look, it's great having you on. You take care, and I know you've got to shoot off. So,
and thanks to everyone who's been sending questions through.
Absolutely.
My apologies if I didn't answer your question. You're always free to put it through to my publisher. Okay.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you so much. You take care and have yourself a great evening.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
I'd like to thank everybody over on Patreon, and an extra special huge thanks goes out to our Patreon heroes. Without you guys over on Patreon, we really wouldn't be able to keep making the video content that you see on this channel. And don't forget that you can also head on over to patreon.com/Jennifer Kirk and check out the different tiers of rewards. Thank you so much. You are absolute legends.